Let's do a quick recap from last time. So we spent most of last time talking about metaphysics and Pieper's discussion of metaphysics. Pieper's description of sort of what it means to philosophize, what it means to engage in this activity of philosophizing, and how it's, he describes it as a kind of relationship that you have as spirit, as a self, as a person, a relationship you have to what he calls the totality of being. It's God and the world, the whole kit and caboodle, okay? And it's really a way of thinking about and experiencing the everyday world, the world right in front of you, in light of this new perspective, okay? And if you're familiar with something like Plato's allegory of the cave, which is this famous allegory, right? That's what this allegory is all about. It's about these prisoners who are down deep in the cave and they think the shadows on the wall are reality. And when one day one of the prisoners' shackle is loosed and he makes the arduous climb out of the cave and sees the real world outside, it dazzles him and he's all confused, right? He sees reality, he sees this higher level of being, and then when he goes back down into the cave, he tries to explain to the people down there, right, that they're looking at shadows. Now, Plato may take this a bit too far in terms of denying the reality of this everyday world, but the kernel to take away from that is basically that there is this, what I said last time, right? Reality is hierarchical. It comes in degrees, and things don't all exist in the same way. There's a fullness of being and a less full version of being. And so a lot of what it comes down to with philosophizing is, being able to see the everyday in light of things like the ultimate nature of reality or the essence of things, right? We talked about all that. And then we also talked about a bit about how this applies to everyone. This is not just something for the eggheads and, it's an activity done up in the ivory tower or anything like that, right? I mean, there is, on the one hand, we want to say that there should be certain people who should be able to engage in that kind of leisurely philosophizing at that level, and there's value to that. But at the same time, there's not an absolute segregation there. And we also talked about how this might be even a bit different than the way the ancient philosophers thought about this, right? Where, they were content to say, here's a leisure class, and then everyone else, the huge masses of humanity are, enslaved, and they don't have anything to do with philosophy. But for us, especially as Christians, this philosophical perspective, you could call it, is something that can really imbue every aspect of your ordinary life, your active life, the life that is the 9 to 5. And we talked about that too when Chesterton was presenting on leisure as well, about how to incorporate that perspective of leisure and what ultimately matters within the mundane, right? And lastly, we also talked about, I gave that quote from St. John of Damascus. I think he gives 6 different definitions of philosophy, but all of them are marvelous and apply to so much of what Pieper is talking about, philosophy as the knowledge of being insofar as it is, and my favorite one at the end, coming at the end, where he says that philosophy is the love of wisdom, but true wisdom is God, therefore philosophy is the love of God. Therefore philosophy is the love of God, because God is wisdom. Yes. Thank you, Bobby. She told me I had to speak up, so if I'm too quiet, I'll get in trouble. Get in trouble with the boss. Yeah. She's got a baseball bat under the pew, if I don't. So that is what Pieper presented as the right way to think about what philosophy is, and the way it was very widely understood among the greatest of the ancient classical philosophers. And then he talks about the contrast here between this classical vision of philosophy and modern philosophy, and that's where we left off. So where does modern philosophy begin? Well, it basically begins with a complaint, a dissatisfaction with the way philosophy has been done. One aspect of this complaint is the idea that philosophy is useless. It's not benefiting anyone, right? That it doesn't have practical value. And this is a theme you see run throughout several modern philosophers, many of whom, would say they're arguing with the other, they're in disagreement with the other guy, but they have this common thread throughout all of them. And then the second reason is they say philosophy is unfinished. we're not making progress. We're not getting these, boxed, nice little answers we can put in a box and tie a bow on it and say, this is the solution to this philosophical problem. So you see this recur all throughout modern philosophy. It does, and when I say modern, I don't mean like, 2020 here or something like that. I mean the modern era broadly, roughly 1600 and 1900 AD, right? So if you look at the usually pointed to as the father of modern philosophy, René Descartes, he says that the goal of his, and he's consciously trying to create a sort of revolution in philosophy, and he says this in his writings, and he says that one of the goals of his philosophy is that, well, if you follow my philosophy, humanity will finally be able to become the masters and possessors of nature. We'll be able to take nature and mold it to our desires and run with that, right? Rather than seeing ourselves as stewards of creation or as kind of priests of creation, like Father Patrick talked about this morning, it's this domination of nature and taking it as a sort of just a resource for us to achieve our appetites, right? You see this in Hobbes, Thomas Hobbes, the philosopher, not Hobbes the tiger, and although he's named after Thomas Hobbes, the philosopher, because of his low opinion of humanity. And I'll leave it to you to figure out who Calvin's named after. And so Hobbes, Hobbes, the philosopher, said, people sometimes attribute this earlier to this other guy, Francis Bacon, but really it's Hobbes who had this idea of knowledge is power. How many of you have heard the idea knowledge is power, right? We've all heard that. And he even goes further and says the goal of knowledge is power, the goal of philosophy, the commodity of human life, okay? The point of philosophizing for them, the point of gaining this kind of knowledge is so that we can become more powerful as human beings, so we can, satisfy our appetites, essentially. Or you have someone like Karl Marx, who complained that philosophy before him just tried to interpret the world, he said, but the point of philosophy is to change it, right? And we know what that means for Marx. Someone like Hegel will come around and say, when he wrote his big magnum opus that, everyone reads, but no one understands a word of it, the Phenomenology of Spirit, he says, my philosophy will no longer be merely the love of wisdom, it will be real knowledge, okay? So there's this idea that philosophy is unfinished and it's not useful enough, right? And moreover, in this modern era, what we see is this framing of philosophy as a kind of emancipation of reason from tradition. Okay, it's the freedom, the liberation of our rationality from the constraints and the chains of tradition and of religion in large part. And it's not just that the modern philosophers thought of themselves this way. They thought of the ancient Greek philosophers as doing the same thing, right? In the middle there, you've got, late antique and medieval philosophy, and that's terrible. But if you go back before Christianity ruined everything, you get back to people like Socrates, and what was Socrates' deal? According to them, he went around and challenged the man, the people, the religion of the day. He was going around and trying to exercise free exercise of his reason to challenge the prejudices of the day and reject all the mythological and fairy tale type beliefs they had. And it was this, and they killed him for it because he was being, too rational. So they even interpret the ancients this way. But Pieper points out that the ancient Greek philosophers did not think of themselves in this way, and he gives lots of evidence for this. I'll give one example. So he gives this quote from Plato's dialogue, the Philebus, where the person of Socrates says, "Knowledge came down to us like a flame of light, as a gift from the gods, brought to us by the hand of some unknown Prometheus from a divine source." And the ancients, for them, they're thinking even further back. Like here they are in ancient Greece, and they're like the ancients, the people centuries before them. The ancients, being better than we are and nearer to the gods, handed this tradition down to us. Pieper's point is, the way the ancient Greeks thought about philosophy is that philosophy itself was rooted in a kind of revelation. It's not just, you go off and exercise your reason in a vacuum. It was something that was a response to a kind of divine revelation to the extent that they understood that. That's how they thought about what they were doing. There was a divine wisdom. We talked about this last time too. There was a divine wisdom, and their philosophy was a response to it and an attempt to participate in it to a certain degree. And so Pieper goes on to say, really, tradition revelation, these are things that are prior to philosophy. Every philosophy, every time you engage in philosophy, you're presupposing an interpretation of the world. And one which is, I'll read the quote here. He says, "There is no such thing as a philosophy which does not receive its impulse and impetus from a prior and uncritically accepted interpretation of the world as a whole." So again, these modern philosophers who think they're just letting their reason finally be free and go loose, they're actually philosophizing against a tradition, against a backdrop. They have assumptions about the nature of the world and how it all works. They have a metaphysics in their background, even as they, try to distance themselves more and more from those idle metaphysical speculations and all that stuff they like to complain about. So accordingly, if you agree with Pieper on this point, and I do certainly, we should reject any kind of stark and too hard a distinction between we have pure reason on the one hand and revelation on the other. This is one today very common way of thinking about the difference between, say, philosophy and theology. The one is an exercise of pure reason. It is something where you could really box away all your theological or religious commitments and just engage in sort of the pure activity of reason. And this is an idea that, we could talk about this if you think this is interesting. There's people you could trace this back to. So let me give you an example. So someone like Aquinas talks about the difference between how, reason proceeds and tries to draw conclusions, and then you have theology where you sort of have a different starting point in terms of what you're trying to accomplish or how you proceed. But you don't see that same sort of stark, absolute separation of the two within a person like Aquinas, because Aquinas, he was a theologian. He wasn't really a philosopher, even though he did some philosophy in the course of doing his theology. But later, when you get to people in the 16th, 17th centuries, they start drawing a much, much starker distinction here and suggesting that it's possible, that it's possible to do something that is pure rationality, pure reason, that has nothing to do with any kind of revelation or tradition whatsoever. But the good news here for us is that there's no need to actually check our faith at the door when we're talking about philosophy. In fact, it would be a mistake to do this, right? And you could think about other people engaging in philosophy. They're not checking their unspoken assumptions at the door either when they're doing philosophy, right? And you shouldn't either, and you shouldn't assume that their unspoken assumptions are like the rational ones and you have the non-rational faith ones, right? It doesn't work like that. We also can't have the situation where we have, we don't want a situation where we think of the philosophy as happening sort of in one wing of our mind and the theology in the other, and they're independent, really totally independent activities. And the other interesting thing to point out here is that when we talk about having a background of a tradition which sets the stage for how you're doing philosophy, it's important to understand too that anyone today doing philosophy, at least in our culture, and maybe some other cultures around the world, it's a different story. But for the most part, the people you're going to be seeing doing philosophy in the Western world, their philosophizing is also, conditioned around Christianity, either its acceptance or its rejection. Okay, either it's going to be they've accepted Christianity and they're doing their philosophy, or maybe they're just inheriting something from when Christian philosophers were writing, and they've sort of accepted that as sort of a given, right? You see this a lot in ethics, for example, where what Christianity brought. Father Patrick has said before, Christianity doesn't have an ethics or amorality exactly, and I get what he's saying there, but so this is a bit of a different point, right? The point here is just there are certain things we all take for granted today as ethical principles. For example, every human life, or all human beings are equal. Let me put it that way. That's probably more accurately the way to put it. This idea that all human beings are in fact equal is not something you found in the ancient pagan world, something that comes in through Christianity, but now everyone in the secular world presupposes is true, right? So they've either accepted it to some degree, or their philosophy is rejecting it. It's an active sort of dialogue with Christianity, right? So I think that's important to keep in mind as well. Even the people who think they're getting away from Christianity are still reacting to it, even if they're rejecting part of it. Okay, so for Pieper, he wants to emphasize that Christians doing philosophy is possible. It's not, and it's not even just possible, right? Let me start with the possible part, actually. So it's possible. You could have some people who could think that, like they're on the more secular side, and they could think, well, Christians can't really do philosophy because, again, they're thinking of philosophy as this free exercise of reason. And Christians, they're not free to philosophize because they already have all these beliefs, right? They can't really question or be critical about certain things because they've already presupposed things, and this is what one of the things Pieper's trying to push back on. But he's saying, no, this is possible, right? It's possible for Christians to ask these philosophical questions and engage in them. And in fact, Pieper goes further. He says, because it draws its life from God's revelation, because the philosophizing takes its impetus and all of its impulse from divine revelation, like the full revelation, it will be better philosophy. It will be truer, even while it's still limited in all the ways we talked about last time, where, you can kind of touch part of the infinite, but you're not going to grasp it. You're not going to tie a string around it and pull it down, George Bailey style, or anything like that. And so then Pieper goes on to say, so one of the reasons this is, it's still important for Christians to do philosophy, it's not just that it's possible, it's that it's, necessary might be going too far, but I'm going to say for now, necessary in some form, and then I'm going to qualify it, necessary in some form, because this part of ourselves that wonders at the world, that seeks wisdom, that wants to have a greater communion with being, is part of what perfects our human nature. It's part of what it means for us to be human, right? And Pieper brought this out when he talked about the difference between our engagement with the world and the sort of mere animal way of engaging with the world. He describes it as the natural bent of the human mind and spirit toward the whole. And again, this has to do with the very meaning of being human in the first place. So that's the claim, and then here's the qualification. So there's obviously limits to the way we would engage in this kind of philosophy, right? And here's a quote from Pieper that I think sums this up really nicely. He says, "It is quite true that our salvation does not require us to philosophize." He's not saying that you need to philosophize to be saved. Only one thing is necessary, and it is certainly not philosophy. The Christian does not and cannot await an answer from philosophy on the subject of his salvation, nor, of course, salvation itself. And so he cannot philosophize as though his salvation depended upon his understanding of the world. So we're not saying that you need to have this, philosophical. You need to get deep into, Gregory of Nyssa's metaphysics or something to be saved. You don't, right? To lose oneself in philosophical problems, to identify oneself existentially, as it were, with them, though characteristic of all philosophizing that does not look beyond itself, is really foreign to the believer. So that's a complicated sentence, so let me just make a few remarks on it. So he's saying that there is a danger in losing yourself in philosophical problems, becoming existentially identified with them. There are people who get, like I said, they get bit by the bug so hard that they feel like they need this question resolved for their life to have, I almost want to say for their life to have meaning. Like they can't let it rest, and they can't have the fullness and the mystery and the transcendence of it, like just be there, right? And he describes this as a philosophizing that does not look beyond itself, that is too wrapped up in the philosophy without having it be part of this bigger, your whole life, right? And so the believer can't behave like that. The believer can't get so sucked in and drawn into the philosophical problems, right? But at the same time, it still has like a proper place that it sits in and a proper role to fill. Okay, and with that, there's obviously limits to philosophical knowledge as well, right? Philosophy is not going to get you nice and neat answers, and that's not the point, really. And, there's other kinds of knowledge besides this kind of philosophical knowledge. It'd be a mistake to identify all knowledge with this, philosophical type of activity. And I think we could all understand that, right? It may be parallel to thinking that all there was to knowledge of God was reading a bunch of theology books, right? I mean, there's this same is true for sort of these philosophical problems in general. It's one thing to read a book about the philosophy of the human person or something, and that's wonderful, but then there's just knowing people, Okay, so there's limits to philosophical knowledge. And it is, I just want to emphasize here, incredibly reasonable, in fact, eminently rational to acknowledge the limitations of reason, to acknowledge the limitations of rationality. And this is something that you see even some of these modern philosophers acknowledge this. We talked about Hume back in the first session as someone who felt like he had butted up against what reason could demonstrate. You see this in people like Kant, you see it in people like Wittgenstein in the 20th century, where they make a big point to say, I just went through this exercise of trying to philosophize, but really it would be a mistake if we thought that reason could tie a nice, neat bow on everything. Okay, so a last note from Pieper. Last point he makes in the lecture. Christianity is more than doctrine. Okay, we all know that. Therefore, Christian philosophy is more than knowledge, and it's more than just reconciling beliefs theoretically. Okay, it means something more like certain ideas and perspectives taking root in you in a deep way and affecting the way you experience the world and think about the world. And so here's another quote from him that summarizes this idea. He says, "The discovery of truth is not merely a matter of hard thinking. And when the truth concerns the meaning of the world, a good brain is not enough. The whole human personality is involved. The undiminished form of Christian philosophy will therefore only be realized by one who has not just learnt his Christianity, to whom it is not just doctrine, with which his conclusions are brought into theoretical and conceptual agreement." So it's not just thinking hard about Christian teaching and thinking hard about philosophical problems and trying to make them stick together, but by one who lets Christianity become real in him, and thus makes these truths his own, not by knowledge alone, but through suffering, he means passively receiving, right, and experiencing reality. Okay, so that's how Pieper ends. I think it's how he ends the whole lecture about the philosophical act. All right. So we're going to say goodbye to Pieper for now. Someone else they could bring him up, but thanks, Pieper. I mean, genuinely, thanks, Pieper. I don't know why that came off sounding so sarcastic, but okay. So that all sounds really nice, right? Okay, so Christianity, philosophy sounds like, they're holding hands and running through a bed of wildflowers or something. Like, that all sounds great, right? But wait a minute, where did we start this whole series? With these questions of, isn't there a tension, right? Isn't there kind of a problem? What do we make of these warnings over, stay away from those vain philosophizings and, the gospel shows the Greek wisdom is foolishness and all that sort of thing, right? Why the discomfort? Why, the animosity even, right? Why the warnings? What does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? Isn't that still a valid concern? And so I want to shift gears here a little bit away from Pieper and talk a bit more about that tension, and then how the church addressed that, and how it actually, what it did with philosophy. Because there were some ways in which the church distanced herself from philosophy, and other ways in which she grabbed philosophy and appropriated large parts of philosophy. And so I think one place to kind of get our heads in the right space here is if we think about what a philosophy was in the ancient world. Okay, we're used to thinking of philosophy as something like a degree or something, or maybe again this sort of purely intellectual or academic sort of exercise. But in the ancient world, a philosophy was really a way of life. Okay, and I mean that it was a way people lived. It was its own culture. It was its own cultus in this sense, right? When you were part of a school of philosophy, it didn't just mean like you signed up for a philosophy class. Philosophers lived in community with each other. They lived in a community with each other. They engaged in spiritual exercises and meditation and that sort of thing. They lived. It was a full culture, right? And as a Christian, you couldn't become a Christian and then go insert yourself into the middle of that culture and then just live as a Christian. They were, in a lot of ways, incompatible, mutually exclusive, right? And so that's one aspect of it. So we have to keep in mind when there are warnings against, being taken away by philosophy, we have to understand that it was a whole separate culture and community that you would be participating in if you went in, head first. Okay.
It was like being part of a secret society.
Something like that. I mean, they weren't secret. But it was like your allegiances and because again, it wasn't this purely, purely intellectual endeavor or something, or like a school classroom or something like that, right? It was. What's that? Yeah, like the Pythagoreans. So no, and this was, yes, right, yes. So to add a little, so if you're not familiar with this, so you all know about the Pythagorean theorem, you all learned it in grade school, but the Pythagoreans were philosophers who recognized that numbers and mathematical sort of entities were really special. They were like, oh my goodness, numbers don't change. They seem to be sort of immaterial and eternal, and they sort of stand a level above this world of flux. And so they actually thought of numbers as like quasi-divine entities, and to some degree worshipped them, worshipped numbers and triangles and things like that. That's what Pythagoreans did. So again, you couldn't go say, I'm going to be a Christian and a Pythagorean, you just didn't really mix those things. They were full ways of life, cultures, okay? And then the other main criticism here from the early Christian standpoint was simply that while there was good stuff in some pagan philosophers, there was a lot mixed in with error, okay? A lot of confusion and a lot of sort of fruitless effort that was being poured into advancing, the theories of Plato or something that wasn't going to help you get any closer to the truth. So you have a passage like this from St. Gregory of Nyssa, from the Life of Moses, and I'm going to come back and qualify this quote later, but just hear what he has to say. I mean, this is, again, pretty stark language. He says he's talking about the life of Moses, obviously, and he's it's this allegorical interpretation, so all these characters and figures are going to represent different things for Gregory, and he's talking about the daughter of the Pharaoh who finds Moses at the bank, and he says this. He says, the daughter of the king, being childless and barren, is rightly perceived as profane philosophy. For truly barren is profane education, which is always in labor but never gives birth. For what fruit worthy of such pangs does philosophy show for being so long in labor? Okay. So again, the critical tension, right? The stuff we saw, not just Tertullian, but there's a real tension here. And so with that sort of, thought in mind that you can't just take profane pagan philosophy and just co-opt it 100%. What do you do with it, right? What do you do with philosophy? And this is where the church steps in and has a really brilliant approach, okay? And in fact, a couple different approaches, because it's not all one thing. It's not all one sort of way of engaging with philosophy. And I'm going to describe this approach generally as something which has sort of two characteristics. One is it is eclectic, and by that I mean we're not just going to say we're going to be Platonists and Christian, or we're going to be Stoics and Christians. There was a picking and choosing, very much a cafeteria-style approach to these pagan philosophers to say, well, there's some good stuff over here, and there's some other good stuff over here, and we're going to bring it all in, okay? We're going to bring in the good pieces we want. And then second, it was a critical appropriation. So they were not shy about, rejecting parts of it. They were not dogmatic. There was no sort of dogmatic adherence to, well, Plato said this, therefore it must be true, or anything like that. There was an understanding of where the priority was, right? This is something that could be useful, but it was something which is trumped in every single case by this fuller revelation. Okay, so how did this manifest itself in various ways in the history of the church? One relatively shallower way that this showed itself in the early days of the church was simply in the use of a lot of philosophical terminology. Okay, and this didn't mean that the people using it were adherents to that philosophical school or what have you. But, for example, you see St. Paul using some terminology which is a little bit of technical terminology that is sort of Stoicism, like Stoic terminology, basically, when it comes to talking about things like conscience, for example. He borrows the terminology, and there's no suggestion that he's like borrowing a full theory or something. It's just the terminology is in the water, it's in the air. He's an educated person, and he's heard, the terminology be used, and he's taking it and using it, applying it to this Christian context. You see this in St. Clement of Rome as well, in his early letter to the Corinthians, where he uses Plato's word for the creator to describe God. The demiurge is Plato's word for it. And he uses that word to describe God as creator, okay? But again, Clement of Rome didn't go on and then say, and here's my treatise on Plato. He just borrowed some of the terminology, okay? That's a relatively shallow level at which the church is still it's fine. I don't mean shallow in a disparaging sense. I just mean, it's just pretty much at the level of some vocabulary that is being borrowed. But then you start to see a bit more, okay? So you have this idea, which you could sum up as philosophy is a kind of stepping stone to something higher, okay? A kind of preparation or propedeutic, you could say, is sort of the technical term that's used sometimes, as a kind of preparatory, almost like a training or something that could help you, understand or engage with the mysteries of the faith more effectively. And so you see this in someone like St. Justin Martyr, who in his dialogue with Trypho, he provides this sort of autobiographical account of, before he became a Christian, he was a philosopher, in this sense of he fully identified himself with these philosophies as ways of life. And he talks about how he went from school to school trying to sort of find the right fit, right? And like what was the truth. And he talked to the Pythagoreans, he was hanging out with them for a while, and he was like, no, not them. And he goes over and he sees the Aristotelians, and he's like, no, not them either. And he finally, he gets to the Platonists eventually, and he's like, yeah, he seems like they have the best thing on offer here. And then he has this encounter with an old man, a Christian, who basically has this dialogue with him and convinces him that there's a lot of confusion mixed in with Plato's idea, because Plato believed that the souls were reincarnated, and there's this sort of eternal cycle of you dying and then getting reincarnated, potentially as different animals and all this stuff. And so the old man kind of talks him out of these, this reincarnation business. And Justin Martyr ends on the note of basically, what I realized was Christianity was the true philosophy. It was the true seeking after wisdom. It was where you could actually find wisdom, right? And it was pure. It was not mixed in with these confusions and errors. But at the same time, he recognizes there that this progression of his was not like he was going in the wrong direction and they started going in the right direction. It built on his previous search for truth, okay, and for wisdom. Or you see, in someone like Clement of Alexandria, there's a great quote from him. He also has this idea of philosophy being a kind of preparation or preparatory training, but he takes it a bit further, because it's not just like in Justin Martyr's case, where you didn't know about Christ and then you kind of climb the ladder and then you could like kick it away at the end because you don't need it anymore. You've reached the higher wisdom. What Clement says is the following. He says, philosophy is in a sense a work of divine providence. It is a divine gift to the Greeks. Before the advent of the Lord, philosophy was necessary to the Greeks for righteousness. And that is some strong language. Philosophy was it was a gift from God, a kind of divine revelation to like Socrates and Plato and people like that. It was necessary to them for righteousness. And now it becomes to all conducive to piety, being a kind of preparatory training to those who attain faith through demonstration. Before the advent of Christ, it prepared mankind to accept his teaching, and now it serves the same purpose. So he wasn't just like, the Jews had the prophets and the Greeks had sort of the philosophers to help prepare them for Christ's coming. He goes further and says it still plays the function of preparing our minds to be essentially to go deeper into our faith, right? So again, this idea of it being there's this, and we saw this in St. John Damascus as well, right? In that quote I read, I said it was part one of a three-part work where the philosophical chapters was like the sort of groundwork he was laying, and then he gets on in the third book to talk about the Orthodox faith, right? It's that same idea of philosophy being a preparation. So that's one way that the church has approached philosophy as, you can engage in this as a kind of propedeutic. But I think there's a much deeper level that the church has engaged in philosophy over the years, and that's really where you see philosophy as more seamlessly appropriated into our theology and into our way of life and into how we think about things like the soul and God and more. You could think of this as full appropriation. It's not just climbing the ladder and kicking it down at the end, where, okay, that was a nice stepping stone, but I don't need it anymore, right? This is something where it becomes an abiding part of our faith, right? And so here, you could contrast this with what I talked about, maybe 15, 20 minutes ago or something, where I said that you could have this idea of philosophy is like philosophy is on one side, your faith on the other, right? They're sort of two wings of your mind, and there's the philosophy is there and it's pure, and you don't mix it with your theological convictions, and your theology's over here. And so another way to put that is you could think of it as some people think of the relationship between philosophy and theology as sort of like two apartments sitting on top of each other. And, maybe the guy downstairs will occasionally come and visit the guy upstairs, but basically they live their separate lives, right? That is not how the church approaches philosophy traditionally. The way that the church approaches philosophy is the guy upstairs went to the guy downstairs, banged on the door, kicked the door down, grabbed half his furniture, and brought it upstairs into the other apartment and said, "This is mine now," right? That's what that's the way that we've actually approached it. This is the image you see recurring throughout all of these church fathers. St. John Chrysostom says this, St. Basil says this, St. Augustine says the following. They all say, it is like the Israelites stealing the Egyptians' gold and making off with it when they left Egypt. They took this pagan thing dedicated to a pagan purpose, and they said, "This is mine now," and they skipped town, okay? That is the church's attitude toward philosophy, really. This is mine now. It's this full appropriation. So, now with that in mind, hear what St. Basil has to say about this. He wrote a sort of short work called An Address to Young Men on the Right Use of Pagan Learning. And this is one of the places where we get that imagery of be the bee, okay, you might be familiar with. He says, "After the manner of the bees must we use these writings, these pagan writings. For bees do not visit all the flowers without discrimination, nor indeed do they carry away entire those upon which they light." So that's a critical appropriation. And they're eclectic. The bees are picky. But rather, having taken so much as is adapted to their needs, they let the rest go untouched, okay? So that's how we approach philosophy. He gives another analogy that I like too, which is basically, it's like you're plucking blooms from a rose bush. Avoid the thorns, get the flowers, and get out of there, right? You don't need the thorns. So just be discerning and pluck the good stuff, leave the other stuff behind. And then, so St. Gregory of Nyssa says something similar. Again, in the life of Moses. This is in the same work. He's not, didn't change his mind or something, right? I read a passage earlier where he said, profane philosophy is, barren, always in labor, but never giving birth, right? But then he goes on to say that really profane learning can be and should be a companion and friend for the higher life, right? So again, by itself, left to its own devices, it's not going to bear fruit. But if we take it as a companion and a friend on our way, it will bring us to a higher plane, a higher level, okay? It will be a companion and a friend to elevate us, okay? And then we see this too, not just among the theologians like St. Gregory. We see this sort of appropriation within our monastic tradition as well. And this is something we might, miss or not realize if we, have this sort of idea in our head of sort of like the intellectual stuff is on one side and the more sort of spiritual, mystical stuff is on the other. No, so much monastic writing is informed by, pretty significantly informed by philosophical concepts. So, one of them came up the other day, I think, Jim mentioned the other day, I think it was Evagrius who described the soul as having a rational part and this sort of insensitive, part that gets kind of angry and spirited and worked up and things like that. And then you have your appetites. And he talks a lot about trying to achieve the right sort of harmony and balance there, or the ruling of the rational part over those other parts. That more insensitive part, that should serve your reason and not, serve your lower appetites. You should be angry at the right things, not just getting ticked off. And again, as I mentioned that at that time, that is a model of the soul that is taken directly from Plato, directly from Plato's work, The Republic. But really, you see this, these sorts of things happen all the time in these monastic contexts. People like St. Macarius, people like St. Ephraim the Syrian, people like St. John Climacus, who borrow these sorts of things all the time at the level of ethics, and sort of ethics and the soul, which we talked about with Evagrius. We see it in the realm of epistemology, where they talk about sort of how do you gain knowledge, and its relationship to self-knowledge, its relationship to being illumined through a kind of purification. All of these are ideas that are present in philosophy. And again, the monks they studied, they spent time reading, they spent time with books, they spent time reading these philosophers and drawing, they spent time being the bee, right? They spent time pouring through these philosophers and pulling out these nuggets, right? And then similarly in the level of metaphysics as well, in how they think about that. So, and then I want to close this part with one of the best examples of this is in St. Augustine, okay? And I'm just going to pull from one work of his, just the Confessions. But there's 3 passages I want to point to, okay? Because his relationship with philosophy is entertaining and interesting and beneficial here, okay? So in Book 3, Chapter 4 of the Confessions, he talks about, he's still a young man, he's 18 or 19 years old, he's going to school for rhetoric, he's doing a great job, top of his class, he's really good at, speaking persuasively, and he's obviously carousing around and living his infamous St. Augustine pre-conversion type of life, right? And he says that one day for his rhetoric class, he picked up a book by Cicero, which we don't have extant today anymore, but it was called Hortensius, or like an exhortation, right? And Cicero's whole work was an exhortation to adopt philosophy, basically. And this is what Augustine says about it. So the title of the book is Hortensius, and it recommends the reader to study philosophy. It altered my outlook on life. It changed my prayers to you, O Lord, and provided me with new hopes and aspirations. All my empty dreams suddenly lost their charm, and my heart began to throb with a bewildering passion for the wisdom of eternal truth. I began to climb out of the depths to which I had sunk in order to return to you. For I did not use that book as a whetstone to sharpen my tongue. It was not the style of it, but the contents which won me over, and yet the allowance which my mother paid me was supposed to be spent on putting an edge on my tongue. It's supposed to be just for the rhetorical flourish of Cicero, but he goes, actually what jumped out at me was this exhortation to seek wisdom, right? I was now in my 19th year, and she supported me. My father had died 2 years before. So he goes on and he says, I'm going to skip a bit, he goes, in Greek the word philosophy means love of wisdom, and it was with this love that the Hortensius inflamed me. There are people for whom philosophy is a means of misleading others, for they misuse its great name, its attractions, and its integrity to give color and gloss to their own errors. Most of these so-called philosophers who lived in Cicero's time and before are noted in the book. He shows them up in their true colors and makes quite clear how wholesome is the admonition which the Holy Spirit gives in the words of your good and true servant Paul, take care not to let anyone cheat you with his philosophizings, with empty fantasies drawn from human tradition, etc. So that passage from Colossians we talked about in the first session. The only thing that pleased me in Cicero's book was his advice not simply to admire one or another schools of philosophy, but to love wisdom itself, whatever it might be, and to search for it, pursue it, hold it, and embrace it firmly. So this he's describing as this encounter with this book about philosophy, and written by Cicero. This is obviously not a Christian work, is the beginning of his turning point. Beginning of his turning point. It altered his outlook on life. It changed. All his empty dreams suddenly started to fade away. This was something that gripped him. Okay, so that's the first passage I wanted to read. The second, a little less positive. So he's talking about how at one point, this is in book 4, chapter 16, and he's only 20 at this point. You think he's still in school. He read Aristotle's book on the 10 categories that came into his hand. Whenever my teacher at Carthage and others who were reputed to be scholars mentioned this book, their cheeks would swell with self-importance, so that the title alone was enough to make me stand agape. Ooh, Aristotle. As though I were poised over some wonderful divine mystery. I managed to read it and understand it without help, though I now ask myself what advantage I gained from doing so. Other people told me that they had understood it only with difficulty, after the most learned masters had not only explained it to them, but also illustrated it with a wealth of diagrams. But when I discussed it with them, I found that they could tell me no more about it than I had already discovered by reading it on my own. And then he summarizes the content of the book, which is this. Aristotle basically talks about these. He's trying to identify more, and this is very much an oversimplification, but basically what are these basic categories of reality? He talks about substance and what are called accidents, and it doesn't mean like a car accident, it just means like the qualities or attributes of a thing, and especially those that are sort of incidental, not strictly necessary, like my hair color can change and does change, but that doesn't mean I'm not me anymore, right? It's just those sorts of more superficial qualities, things like that. What profit did this study bring me? None. In fact, it made difficulties for me because I thought that everything that existed could be reduced to these 10 categories, and I therefore attempted to understand you, my God, in all your wonderful, immutable simplicity in these same terms, as though you too were substance, and greatness, and beauty were your attributes, in the same way that a body has attributes by which it is defined. So he says that not only was it not fruitful for him, it was misleading because he started to think of God as reducible to these 10 categories that Aristotle enumerates, right? And now I want to point out something very interesting, okay? I read a quote last time from St. John of Damascus, part of his book entitled The Philosophical Chapters. He starts with a little description of philosophy, and then he launches into a 100-page commentary on Aristotle's categories. That is what the book is. Interesting. So it's not as if the judgment of the church, right, as it were, like there's some one monolithic thing where like, is Aristotle's categories valuable or not? Augustine didn't care for it. In fact, found it misleading. St. John of Damascus found it very helpful. And you see it, you do see it in some other church fathers as well. But the point there is, two different bees maybe took something a little bit different away from the same flower, okay? And that's okay. I think that's important to keep in mind. It's not like there's anything inherently wrong with Aristotle's categories if you understand the limitations of it, etc. But I just wanted to point out that contrast that I found interesting. And which one of them is like the Western father, right? That's an interesting thing too. Okay, finally, from Confessions, Book 7, Chapter 9, he talks about, this is a somewhat of famous passage, but Augustine talks about how he started reading what he calls the Platonists, and he's not reading Plato. He's reading. There's this movement. It came about after Christianity called Neoplatonism in the 2nd century A.D., which was sort of a Plato revivalist school of philosophy, but they also added a lot of their own stuff. And so what he was probably reading here is, I believe it would have been a work called the Enneads by Plotinus. But he goes on and says that he picked up this book, and he says, though the words were different and the meaning was expressed in various ways, I also learned from these books that God the Son, being himself like the Father of divine nature, did not seek in the rank of God had a prize to be coveted. But they do not say he did. So he goes on, I'm not going to read you the whole passage, but his basic idea is he keeps coming back to this thing where he says, I read the book, and though they didn't use the same words, they were describing the same content as, in some cases he says it's like John chapter 1 and about the word being God. And then he goes on and he says, well, and then there were some things that they did not say that I would find in my faith, right? And he goes on, and it goes on for quite a bit, but here's the punchline of it. He says at the end, where does he say this? Here we go, okay. Yeah, here's where he says it. Okay, so he says, it was, at the end of this passage, he says, it was from the Gentiles, from these Platonists, that I had come to you, God, and I set my mind upon the gold which you willed your people to carry away from Egypt, for wherever it was yours. Wherever it was yours. And I think that summarizes his attitude toward philosophy in this place. Because he doesn't say that, hey, the Platonists agree with the Christians. He says they were speaking your truth in different words, and they didn't necessarily realize it, okay? Wherever it was yours, okay? So the gold, it really belongs to us. Through your apostle, you told the Athenians that it is in you that we live and move and have our being, as some of their own poets have told us. And of course, the books I was reading were written in Athens, But your people had used the gold that was yours to serve the idols of the Egyptians, for they had exchanged God's truth for a lie, reverencing and worshiping the Creator in preference to the Creator. And it was not upon these idols that I set my mind. So again, you're taking it, appropriating it, and doing so in a very, very full, robust way that acknowledges, where they, what they had and what they didn't have. Okay. So I find all that, all of these are good models for thinking about these philosophical ideas and how they can be appropriated and brought in. Okay, so to wrap up this whole series, I think we can pose ourselves a few questions about how we can apply this here in our culture and in our forthcoming school and all that sort of thing, and in our personal lives as well, which we talked about a little bit last time. I think one important question for how we can make philosophy part of this bigger picture is by asking the question, who's appropriating whom? Who's assimilating whom? What stands at the core, okay? Because there's definitely a temptation to start with a core set of philosophical beliefs, or start with an ideology, and let that ideology be the core of how you see the world and how you think about things. We can all probably think of some examples of that. If you take this ideology and put it like right here at the center in the core as the animating principle behind everything else, okay? Because that's the danger, that the appropriation will go in the wrong way. You start with this very philosophical ideology and you dress it up in sort of Christian garb and you pretend it's Christianity, and it's not. It has to be the other way around. It has to be that at the core of it stands Christ himself, stands the church, stands the faith, and the stuff that we take and appropriate in has to cohere with that. It has to cohere with that, not the other way around. And remember, we're eclectic. We don't just subscribe to, this is my ideology. We can take, and ideology obviously has a much more negative connotation, but think more broadly of sort of among the range of philosophical works, what are the pieces we can take and appropriate? And you might be surprised at to what extent this is possible. I mean, you want to be careful. You don't want to be naive about it, but you might be surprised at the extent this is possible. I know of a guy who teaches philosophy classes up in Jordanville at the seminary there, the Rocore Seminary there, and his research is on Hegel and Maximus the Confessor. Okay, not saying go and subscribe to Hegelianism. It's pretty wonky, but he sees. He in his little B activity is presumably seeing pieces that he can pull from Hegel that will enrich our faith. Okay, I wouldn't want to do it, but Godspeed to him. Okay, and then the other piece here, is I think we need to also avoid extremes when we're thinking about philosophy here, right? The one extreme being a kind of misology, and I didn't say mythology, like centaurs and stuff like that. I mean misology, just like you have misogyny as a kind of, hatred of women. Misology is a hatred of the logos, hatred of reason, okay? We can't have that attitude of, turning away anything and sort of fleeing into a kind of obscurantism or like, just deeper into the fog and say, well, we can't explain anything or we can't talk about anything, perfectly adequately, therefore we just should never say anything at all. And then on the other extreme, we obviously don't want to fall into a kind of rationalism, this idea of there being a pure autonomous reason that can investigate all these things all by itself. That would be a mistake as well. And I don't think Orthodox are typically have that problem, but I can think of one or two examples where I think that's probably what happened to maybe a certain prominent Orthodox writer and theologian. Where, again, something else takes the core and the center, and it's a philosophical belief and a philosophical commitment that is driving out the other things. So in the end, what we want is a kind of balance, right? And something that is both eclectic and critical and can really be appropriated and synthesized with our faith, something that will help us enter more deeply into the mystery of God, and this is something both at the level of your personal life. It could be, again, the ditch digger, the person who is offering their work up as that sacrifice, where your altar is your desk or your workbench or your operating table or what have you, and it could be someone who is finding creative ways to integrate this contemplative dimension into their active everyday life. And then on the level of education as well, we talked about how philosophy can provide a kind of glue or a holistic perspective that connects these areas of knowledge together, and then how that can inform the way that you approach all of the areas of education, right? And I'll come back to that thing everyone was saying during the school meeting, where they said they wanted to make sure we understood all of these areas of education are connected, right? That they're all part of the same one wisdom of God, who is ultimately Christ himself, the Logos.